This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 542, entitled Becoming Abolitionists, Historically and Now. Description. This flyer presents the close historical analogy between Negro slavery 2 centuries ago and man's slavery today. People had to learn a hatred for the immorality of Negro slavery. Masculists today are teaching men a similar hatred of man's slavery that fluffies the world over commit against men, forcing men to be man's slaves, working for women for decades of their lives, a hugely greater crime than was the moral abomination of Negro slavery. Flyer itself. Becoming Abolitionists, Historically and Now, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This flyer is an exercise in consciousness raising. That is, it aims to provide ideas that will make it easier for both sexes to see fluffydom as man's slavery and man's slavery as slavery, and hence something to be hated and be seen as a war issue. It uses a historical analogy, that is, the development of abolitionism in the US in the 1800s and the development of abolitionism in the world today. Making a close analogy between the two should make it easier to see fluffydom as man's slavery and hence something to be hated. Hopefully, this argument will prove to be very useful to masculists in the coming decade as millions of men push for the liberation of men, for the masculist cause. How did abolitionism in the US in the 1800s develop? Arguably, the first public abolitionist in the US was a hero of mine whom I identify with, whose name was William Lloyd Garrison, who published the first abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator in 1831, in which he railed against the massive injustice and criminality of Negro slavery. That was the economic foundation of the agricultural southern states of the US. It found the Negro slavery system abhorrent, inhumane, profoundly exploitative, vile, sickening, and a crime that needed to be fought against morally and legally. But he faced overwhelming odds, since the livelihoods of millions of Southerners depended on the Negro slavery system. The Southern states had grown rich by exporting cotton to the UK, which was undergoing its industrial revolution, using steam engines to drive mechanical weavers to create cheap items of clothing. The cotton gin had been invented that allowed efficient extraction of cotton seeds from the cotton. So vast cotton plantations grew up in the South that used several million Negro slaves to grow the cotton. Garrison used his newspaper to spread his hatred of Negro slavery, and over time his word got out. Abolitionist groups were set up. Churches got involved, who said that Negro slavery was very un-Christian. Novelists like Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote her famous book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, in 1852, which pointed out how cruel and inhumane Negro slavery was, which caused millions of Americans to learn to hate slavery. The book raised the consciousness of millions of Americans on how evil an institution Negro slavery was, to such a point that when President Lincoln met her, his opening words were, quote, So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war. In brackets, referring to the US Civil War that was raging at the time he met her. The immorality of Negro slavery was the root cause of the US Civil War that cost the lives of over 500,000 soldiers on both sides. But it took time for the Northerners to become abolitionists. Very few people were abolitionists at the time of Garrison's first abolitionist newspaper in 1831. People had to be persuaded that Negro slavery was a moral abhorrence. That attitude did not come falling out of the sky. People had to be exposed to moral arguments and presented evidence as to why Negro enslavement was a horrible thing that should be gotten rid of. Over the few decades from the appearance of The Liberator in 1831, other abolitionist newspapers started circulating, and many abolitionist clubs were set up to push for the abolition of Negro slavery. It took 3 decades, plus the 4 years of the US Civil War, to get rid of Negro slavery in the US. Britain had gotten rid of its slavery system thanks largely to the conviction of Lord Wilberforce, who lived just long enough to see the legal emancipation of Negro slaves in the UK itself in 1807 and its colonies in 1833. For millions of Americans in the early decades of the 1800s, Negro slavery as an institution was unquestioned, just part of the scenery. For example, imagine you were the daughter, 20 years old, of a cotton plantation owner in a southern state, setting out in your horse and buggy Saturday morning to ride to town for some shopping. On the way to town, you see the Negro slaves working in the cotton fields on either side of you. You think nothing of it, since you have grown up with it. Negro slavery seems to you the norm, the unquestioned norm, the unconscious norm, so you don't give it a thought. But in town, you hear your first Yankee abolitionist who is saying such crazy things as, "Negro slavery is a moral abomination. The slaves should be paid for their labor, as is anyone else. How would you like to be enslaved, forced to work for another person without pay?" End quote. His words would be shocking to you because your father needs his slaves to work in the cotton fields to be able to afford the rich lifestyle he gives his wife and children. You would feel very threatened by the fiery words of the Yankee abolitionist, the first you have ever heard in your life. Now we jump to the present and begin to make the analogy between Negro slavery in the 1800s in the US and man's slavery in the whole world today. Just how are they analogous? There's been a huge change in women's role over the past century or so. Women have taken up the traditional male role of being careerists, working for a wage or a salary for their work. Why did this happen? It was men who liberated women from household drudgery, who worked from dawn till dusk on the farm, doing a myriad of household chores with her dozen kids. Being a housewife on the farm in those days was definitely a full-time job. Women truly earned their keep in those days. But then men gave women science-based medicine, so that today women have a life expectancy of 85 years. Men also gave women the pill, household gadgets, higher education. So women now have usually 0, 1 or 2 kids, so have a career window of half a century. This new reality changes everything for the Masculists, who stand up, pointing the finger at women, claiming, "Now that you women can work, you must work. Otherwise, you are seen by the Masculists as being man-slavers." End quote. Masculists claim that, effectively, fluffydom is manslavery. Fluffydom, that is, the institution of raising young women to be fluffies, that is, traditional women who expect to be able to live off the money and labour of a man, thus manslaving him for decades, close brackets, may have been obvious and necessary over a century ago when women had a dozen kids and worked on the farm from dawn till dusk. But in today's world, women have a career window of half a century, so have a powerful moral obligation to FIP up, that is, become FIPs, that's financially independent persons, by bothering to get a career competent education so that they can be FIPs as adults and not expect, fluffy style, to parasite off the money and labour of a man, thus manslaving him for decades of his life. I read now that in the UK, young men care more about the level of fitness of a young woman whom they are considering as a potential girlfriend than they do about her looks, which, if you think about it, is a very strong statement, since young men are hardwired to be attracted to a pretty woman's face, since built into their male DNA is the correlation between prettiness and good genes that will allow the woman in question to produce healthier offspring. These young men are increasingly exposed to masculist and MGTOW, that's men going their own way, ideas that tell them to not get married and to not have kids, since the hated fluffy feminists have taken over the divorce courts and made them so toxic for divorcing fathers that they've made marriage and paternity toxic for young men who choose to live the MGTOW lifestyle instead, rejecting marriage, rejecting paternity, and spending their money on themselves. These young men are looking at these young women with a very cold eye, asking themselves, quote, "Is this woman a fluffy? Does she know anything about masculism and MGTOW? Does she expect to live off my money and labour for decades of my life? In other words, does she expect me to be her manslave for decades of my life? Will she take me, with one chance in 4, through the hated, fluffy feminist controlled divorce court system and rip my kids away from me, take my house, force me to hand over half my wealth and stuff to her, make me pay for my kids, whom I'll hardly be allowed to see? And will she expect me to pay her alimony for the rest of my life, while she continues to sit on her fat, parasitic, man-slaving ass and not be morally nor legally obliged to FIP up and pull her own financial weight? Fuck that. I absolutely refuse to face a one chance in 4 of losing my kids and being a manslave to a hated, fluffy parasite. I hate fluffies. I hate their manslavery. I hate their immorality. I hate their evil parasitism. God, it's worse than negro slavery was 2 centuries before, since there are several billion man-slaves in the world today, compared with only several million negro slaves in the US in the early 1800s. Man-slavery is a much bigger problem." End quote. The Masculists are now busy preaching to men, millions of men, that women now have a career window of half a century, even those women who take some years off to look after the children when they are small. So Masculists put enormous moral pressure on women to FIP up or be totally rejected, spat at, and viciously excluded by men, both socially and sexually, for being hated manslavers. Most women take it for granted that, quote, "Men exist on this earth to pay for women to have babies." End quote. This is a deeply ingrained attitude and expectation that women have regarding men. It's this expectation that the Masculists are killing off by killing off those fluffy women who have this attitude. Masculists kill off such women slowly by totally ignoring them, forcing them to rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and viciously rejected by men for being decades-lasting man-slavers and hence hated. Masculists preach to men, millions of men, via the internet, that women oppress men far worse than vice versa, since many of women's gender crimes last decades. For example, manslavery, which is the biggest of all gender crimes. Women's butchery of one father in 4 in the divorce courts. Women's forced fatherhood in the forms of pill lying and paternity fraud, etc. Men are waking up in their millions now and getting angrier and more hateful by the month against women's gender crimes against men, particularly against women's, that is, fluffies, decades-lasting man-slavery. Masculists expect women to fip up, and if they don't, then they won't get a man, as Masculist and MGTOW ideas spread across the planet. Increasingly, men see man-slavery as a worse affliction than was negro slavery, given the hugely larger numbers of man-slaves in the world. Masculists expect women to fip up so that men can be freed from the horrible traditional price of being a manslave to a woman for decades of his life, just to get a bit of sex from her from time to time. In today's world, that horrible price is no longer needed, so men expect women to pull their own financial weight or rot on the shelf. With men released from manslavery at the hands of the hated fluffies, men can then afford to adopt alternative lifestyles instead of working for decades for a woman. He is then freer to pursue other interests of his, becoming something better, something finer than just a manslave working for a woman so that